What's up, everybody? Welcome to the TrineDay Studio Sessions podcast. My name is Scott Armstrong here, and I'm very excited for the final episode of this amazing historic deep dive that we've been doing, presenting the work here, Two World Wars and Hitler, who was responsible, by Dr. Jim MacGregor, Dr. John O'Dowd, and we have had such in-depth conversations about so many topics covered in the book. We haven't even had a chance to dive into even a portion of the contents of the book. So I definitely want to encourage all of you, go to TrineDay.com, get yourself a copy of the book. It's the holidays have just passed, I know, but I know everybody out there still needs a copy of it as a gift or whatever, because this information is so valuable and so important. So as we move through the book, as we move through the narrative, we're bringing you such a fantastic group of people here to discuss some of these topics. Of course, we have the authors, Dr. Jim MacGregor, Dr. John O'Dowd, here present with us. We have Chris Milligan, TrineDay Books, TrineDay Publishing. We have Professor Richard Spence. We have forensic historian Richard Grove. We have filmmaker, historian extraordinaire Sean Stone. Matthew Arrett is here, and Adam Finnegan from TrineDay Books, and of course Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. And so, you guys, I'm so excited for this presentation. Chris, I'm going to kick it to you. Where do you want to start with the narrative here?
Well, I first want to talk about this amazing book, Two World Wars and Hitler. Like I've said before, I've read lots of books about money power. I've read lots of books about war. I've read lots of books about Hitler, but there is nothing that puts that whole story together as Two World Wars and Hitler. I mean, we have two Scottish scientists taking on British historians, and they do a dang good job because, historians basically construct their history from, paperwork, and scientists look at something and they test the validity of it. And they tested the validity of what some of these British historians were telling us about our history, and they found that to be wanting. And I'll have to admit, as a small publisher, I was very concerned because it's a very big book. It's 800 pages, and how many people out there read an 800-page book? And the thing that we're finding is that a lot of people do. I mean, the book on Amazon has 28 reviews, and all of them are 5-star. Matter of fact, there's this one, and it says, I fully agree with most of the other commentators. Actually, this book deserves 6 stars. Okay. And so I just can't say enough about this book, and also the privilege that I have had in publishing books, starting off as a intelligence brat who heard my dad tell me some things that I didn't understand, and then spending years and years just trying to understand how the world works. Okay. And that's what this book does. It helps us to understand how the world works. And I am so overjoyed to have, this panel of people that have also spent, much of their lives and times trying to figure out how the world really works. And not only that, but putting, their careers and lives on the line to tell people about it. So I can't say enough about what we have here and what we are accomplishing, okay, in helping people understand the perfidy that we've been living in. So thank you very much, Scott, for helping us get all this together, and for your time today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, of course, in my introduction, I failed to mention the great Guido Preparata zooming in from Italy. So thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thank you, sir.
Such an esteemed panel here. So as we move forward, like I think when we first discussed this podcast, we were going to go through chapter by chapter, and we were going to unpack the contents of the book. And I think we've made it to what, like chapter 3, chapter 4, after like 5 episodes. Okay, so we've gotten like not even to page 100 in the book, and there's just so much to talk about that's taken up 4 entire podcast episodes that that just tells you how much valuable information is in here. So Let's see. So as we start off here, so let's just look here. Chapter 4, War by Royal Warrant. In the early 19th century, Britain had a very narrow franchise with the vote restricted to a small group of wealthy land and property owners. Is that where you guys want to start? Maybe we'll kick it to Jim or John. Like, what are you guys thinking here?
You know, we did get all the way up to Pootsie Hafenstangle.
Yep.
Okay, let's give it to the authors, Jim and John.
Okay, I'll jump in. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Scott. I wanted to, rather than get into specifics of the book, I thought I would maybe just discuss and see what the panel thinks about how history is controlled, and who controls it. How do they? What is the role of historians themselves, academic historians, in this control of history? When I started reading Carroll Quigley, I don't know, 25 years ago now, maybe, and I was engrossed with his statement that there was this secret cabal, an Anglo-American secret cabal comprising very rich and powerful men in Britain and the United States. And this group, according to Quigley, they controlled politics in Britain and America, and they controlled journalism in Britain and America, and they also controlled education. And through education, Quigley says, they controlled the writing and teaching of history of their own time. Now, I started digging into this, a good number of years ago when Jerry Docherty and I were writing some books together about the First World War. And what we found was that it was actually this money power was directly responsible for the First World War. They long planned it from about 1902 and created all the necessary alliances to take Germany on, because they knew Britain could never take Germany on its own. So King Edward VII especially built up the alliances. But the strange thing is, no mainstream historian discusses any of this. No mainstream historian that I've come across really tackles Quigley's work, whether it's to praise it or denounce it. They just seem to be totally blank. And the same I found goes for the incredible work that Anthony Sutton, and you know him, Chris, Anthony Sutton. He did tremendous work on Russia and the building up of Hitler. And then I would mention Guido Preparata, who's on here tonight. His book was fantastic. These people basically, when you read all the mainstream history books on the First World War and went into the 1920s and 30s, I've got most of them here in my room. You never find any trace of them. Historians questioning what Quigley and what Sutton was about, what Preparata was saying. They just seem to be blanked. It's washed out. I wanted to see how historians create the false history of the First World War. They had three main methods, and one of them, first one probably the most important, I would think, was, and this again is referring back to Quigley's fantastic work. Quigley says this cabal controlled Oxford University, particularly All Souls College and Balliol College, two of the major colleges within Oxford University. And he said that they controlled education through Oxford. Oxford was seen as the pinnacle of British academia, and the people who worked there, the professors who worked there, were seen as the gods of academia. If they said something, it must be right, because they were Oxford. And I discovered that Quigley said they controlled history through Oxford. And when I started reading up some of the pamphlets, the Oxford historians, the professors there, immediately the First World War began, they started producing pamphlets. The Oxford pamphlets, they're called. They produced about 86 in total over the length of the 4 years of the First World War. But they started producing them literally within days of the war starting. They were creating this history of the war when it was 2 days old. And they were saying this war was down to the despicable behavior of Kaiser Wilhelm and his generals and his bankers. They wanted to take over Europe and crush the rest of us. And brave Britain was fighting for freedom and civilization. So young men, every one of you get out there and put a uniform on and fight these Huns. So that was one method. They created this fake history. And not only were they producing Oxford pamphlets, they were producing books. I've got books as thick as that, big leather-bound books that are giving a story of the war, and it's all unbelievable baloney and lies. But that's one case. The second way they controlled the history was in around the first few weeks of the ceasefire, in early 1919, the money power got together a big team in Paris. They enlisted about 1,000 US Army personnel, men that should have been demobbed and starting to go home, but they kept them back in France, Europe, and 1,000 men, at least 1,000 men, officers and men, some of them historians. And the money power drafted in one of their favorite sons and agents, Herbert Hoover, the guy who would later become president of the United States, his reward, in fact, for doing all the stuff for the secret society. And these guys decided that they would send teams out. These 1,000 men would be split up into teams, and they would send them out to all the countries in Europe, all the major cities, and they would collect all the war documents relating to how the war started and what happened. And Hoover drafted in from Stanford University, an old friend of his, Professor Ephraim Adams, and he brought a team of about 12 junior historians over from Stanford to deal with this. And within weeks, lorries and cars, trucks were pouring into Paris loaded with documents from virtually every capital city in Europe, and they had collected documents for secret war councils, the German War Council. They'd got all their documents. They'd got all the documents from relating to Kaiser Wilhelm's behavior before the war, and they brought them in to Paris. And what did they do with these? Why were they doing this? Why were they collecting all this? The official story from Stanford nowadays where these documents are is that it was all done for peace and preserving peace in the future, and so the documents wouldn't get wasted and lost. The professors sifted them somewhat in Paris, and then they were all created and they were shipped away to Palo Alto, Stanford University in the East Coast of America. And there's pictures on the Hoover Institute website just now that there's huge mounds of these on the docksides. I mean, it's literally unbelievable the amount of documents they took. And initially, for the first 20 years, they stored them in basements all over Stanford University, kept them secure before they built the Hoover Institution Tower that we all know about and placed them in there. The thing about this was, in the reason for taking these documents, these primary source documents, was that in historians' research methodology, the gold standard for doing research in history is having the primary source documents, documents that were created around the time that you're examining in your story. And they were talking about government documents, they were talking about secret military documents, the Kaiser's documents, stuff like this. And without those documents, academic historians really can't build a picture, because that's the thing they've limited themselves to. primary source documents. So this was the reason I later discovered. This was the reason that they got rid of all these documents from Europe. Jerry and I considered, when we started looking at this, we decided to look in Europe as a major crime scene. And what we would do is, rather than, we weren't historians, Jerry had a degree in history, but we'd rather than look at this from a historian's point of view, we would treat it as a crime scene, and we would consider ourselves police detectives trying to find out who was responsible for this great crime that happened, this mass slaughter, 20 million people in Europe slaughtered.
Yes, and that Hoover Institute is where Professor Sutton was, and where he, they asked him to write this book about the Soviet, the Western influence on Soviet technology, and he got to the point where he was going to release the third volume, and they said, no, we don't want you to do that. And Anthony didn't quite understand that, and they asked him, they said, don't break your rice bowl, but he went around them and went ahead and issued that third volume as national suicide, because what he had discovered in some of those documents at the Hoover Institute at Stanford was that a bunch of the war materials that were being used to prosecute the Vietnam War, okay, were coming from factories that had been built by the Americans. And so again, the construct of history, not just from historians, but from politicians. And as my father told me, he said, the secret societies are here, and it's all a big game that they're playing to get us into positions. Now, Jim produced a book called Hidden History of World War I that was put out by a major publisher. He came back with a second one called Prolonging the Agony. They wouldn't do it, and we had the privilege of publishing in that. And if you want to read a book that's going to completely change your attitude of what happened during World War I strongly recommend that. Now, we were talking about Pootsie Hafenstengel, and I know John has some stories about Pootsie that he could tell us.
Well, I was actually hoping we could stay on this for a minute, because I think this is a fascinating little rabbit hole to tap into. And I think maybe we could put it back over to Richard real quick. The idea of how history is constructed by these, historians in their ivory towers based on evidence that a lot of it's been it's been destroyed, as Jim was saying, right? And so how do we properly reconstruct an accurate portrayal of history if in light of the fact that maybe some of those primary documents have been destroyed? Or how do we forensically reassemble what we know to have happened and provide context to understand it? So, Richard, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's important to touch on a lot of things that Jim said. It's important to find the primary sources, the artifacts that still exist. So Chris was just mentioning, let me zoom out, National Suicide by Anthony Sutton. This is the third volume of his Western Technology and Soviet series that he was doing. And then he gets fired from Hoover Institute by David Packard of Hewlett Packard, because he's in the trilaterals, and Sutton starts looking into the Trilateral Commission. Well, that's the same David Packard that later fires Steve Jobs from Apple. Famously portrayed in a variety of movies, that situation is. So now let's go back to Oxford and what Jim was saying about Oxford. It's a 1,000-year-old university. It's the heartbeat of the empire. It's the seat of colonization, and it's like the brain trust of narco-terrorism in its historical form in the East India Company, and then the privatization of opium to places like the Russell and Company in 1832 and the Skull and Bones. That's the privatization year of the narco trafficking system that the East India Company had. So this history that we have not been taught in schooling is indicative of indoctrination. It's not education. Education would let you find books like Sean Stone's New World Order, for which Guido wrote the afterword. I wrote the foreword for this. And in between, you have an unassailable thesis. It's Sean's PhD thesis for history at Princeton, I believe. unassailable, that shows the British influence further than Quigley did in Anglo-American establishment and Tragedy and Hope put together. So, building upon Sutton and Quigley, the New World Order, A Strategy of Imperialism, published by TrineDay, is one of the pieces. It's like a Rosetta Stone that can help you understand the history and lineage of people like Quigley and Clinton and Kissinger and a whole lot of other movers and shakers in 20th century history that have reflected very much an Anglo-American mindset of globalist internationalism, as David Rockefeller called it in his memoirs. So there is something to all of this. It's not conspiracy theory. Quigley himself was lied to by Macmillan when they destroyed the plates to his book, and you couldn't read as a citizen Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time. So over the past 40 or 50 years, there have been ardent strides made by Sutton and Quigley and G. Edward Griffin and others who were intrepid in their research and persistent that there exists a top-down influence on our government that is international and does not follow the Constitution, has no purview to protect our rights, and very much erodes our rights at every shape and turn. So that will be the gist of why it's important to pick up books like Two World Wars and Hitler, because that helps you understand that which they are very much invested in hiding from us, because it's the truth that you can get that allows you to have better choices, judgments, and decisions in life, and leads back to freedom.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Richard.
Amen.
So, Sean, Richard was just highlighting your book, New World Order, that he wrote the forward to. And we were kind of piggybacking off of what Jim was saying in terms of reconstructing history from potentially some limited information to get an accurate portrayal. And you mentioned stuff about Oxford, and Richard was talking about it there and was wondering what your thoughts were on that angle of the puzzle.
The Oxford angle?
Yeah.
I mean, education, as we know, is the key. I always emphasize to people, the nature of power is paradigms. So, we obviously, all of us are researching and writing and working in this field, trying to understand, at the end of the day, how power works, right? Who is in charge? When we look at conspiracies, right, there's these ineffable conundrums we face, right, when it comes to, take the JFK assassination, which I was exposed to at a young age, and certainly has been a fascination of my father for the last 40 years. We don't know at the end of the day who called, who made a call and said this guy has to go, right? There's always this question of power. How does power really work? And so I think when we look at the nature of paradigms and ideas, that's oftentimes kind of a little bit more tangible for us. And so how do paradigms and ideas get perpetuated, right? It starts with the grooming process in the education system. And so with my book on the New World Order, where I was focusing on William Yandell Elliott, who was emeritus professor of politics for 40 years. He taught many people, including JFK and the Bundys and Brzezinski, and he was relatively close to Sam Huntington. And so it's the transmission of an ideology that he himself had picked up at Oxford, studying with I can't remember what was his mentor's name, but essentially he was one of the guys that was a proxy of the Milner faction. And so for me, it was this interesting idea of the transmission of ideas, right? And once you, like, as we know, once you adhere to a certain idea or ideology, right? That's how conspiracies oftentimes are perpetuated across time, right? So that the nature of empire doesn't dissolve, once Babylon falls, or once Rome falls, or once Venice falls, or once the British Empire transitions out of an empire into a commonwealth, right? A more benevolent version of empire, so-called. But the ideology remains, right? It's based in the merit, in the legal structures, the legal systems itself that is established and imposed on the former colonies and then across the planet. It's perpetuated through allegiances that people have, to this sort of this Anglo-American worldview, right? The Anglo-American dominant worldview that carries over into NATO, into Western Europe, and whatnot. So again, to me, it's about dissemination of information and how knowledge is sort of kept in a way of, you get groomed and brought into a system. And that's why I always emphasize to people, once you show your ability to think critically and independently, you become dissident, right? It's very difficult to get recruited into these conspiracies. So as a result, it's very hard for us to really know what the heck's going on inside the system, because we never got recruited into it, because we ideologically were not predisposed to, just buying in, to going, as I say, go along to get along, right? And just to mount these steps of power. And then as a result, it's very difficult to then have whistleblowers coming out who really know how these things work, right? How the conspiracy, really gets actuated. You get a few guys from CIA writing books occasionally, but it's like they're rarely the guys that actually are operationally running these assassination plots, right? Or whatnot. Or really in the high levels of finance.
Or it's just a limited hangout half the time.
Could be, yeah. So again, it's very interesting to me, how we can sit here and speculate and talk about these things, but at the end of the day, we're all analyzing it from outside the real pinnacles of power.
Yeah.
Well, my dad was in the CIA. My older brother got recruited. He said no. And then I ended up getting recruited for the Chicago mob and said no. So, and what he said, he said, Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it. And then he said, and communism's all a sham. These same secret societies are behind it. It's all a big game. And that's really what I've seen, is that it's a secret societal that are imposing their will through intelligence agencies, religious organizations, criminal gangs, and to affect sovereign countries, because your main level up there is a secret societals, and then you have sovereign countries. I had some discussions with some people. They say it's just class warfare is the dynamic. I think it's more.
Yep, could be. Well, now I want to get back to where we left off. So, John, I'm gonna kick it back to you here. So,
Well,
give us like the really quick rundown of this Pootsie character, so we can pick up from where we left off, and then we can continue on with the conversation. So, give us like a minute or less summary of what we discussed about this Pootsie character, how he fits in, and then we'll move on from there.
Well, I'd never heard of Pootsie until Jim MacGregor introduced me. Am I muted?
No, you're good. We got you.
Until Jim MacGregor introduced me to him, and it was absolutely astonishing. This is a guy who was an American German, or German American, who was born in Germany, but his mother was from a line of Boston Brahmins. His father was from the minor aristocracy in Germany, but well integrated with their royal family, and who were independently rich through art dealing and other activities, and who was sent to Harvard as a young man, who immediately came under the wing of his relative, President Eliot of Harvard, and who learned a whole load of things at Harvard, including how to act, he was a brilliant musician. He learned to act with the Hasty Pudding Club, and he was involved with the football team and cheerleading and all sorts of stuff like that. And then when he left Harvard, he'd become friendly with the Roosevelts, and had started running his family's art store in Fifth Avenue, and was very, very wealthy at the time of the golden age of the early parts of the 20s. And then suddenly, after he'd just taken a young wife, he went to war-riven Germany, destroyed Germany, and set up shop in Germany with his new wife and their new child. And for some reason, leaving the wealth and comfort of New York to go to war-destroyed Germany. And then by some means or other, he became, well, we know the means. He was told to become introduced to Hitler by colleagues or by mentors or by handlers in the American embassy in Germany. And he became best friends with Hitler, and he mentored him, and he participated with him in the beer hall putsch. And he was involved with his recovery from that scenario, and he visited him in jail, and he helped him apparently with Mein Kampf, and then was involved with him again at the burning of the Reichstag, was deeply involved in the burning of the Reichstag. Of course, we were talking about paradigms earlier, but they don't just control the paradigms, they actually make the history, and they do that through their activities, through insinuating people like Putzi into Germany. Hitler had been talent spotted, apparently, and Putzi's job was to bring him on, and he taught him how to speak, and he taught him how to present himself, and he taught him how to behave in polite circles. And he then became deeply involved in it. He was his press officer. And then suddenly, just before the war, he apparently, according to him, he himself and his biographers, got tipped off that Hitler was suspicious of him, and he opted out he was dropped off from a plane and managed to get to Switzerland and ended up in the UK, who moved him back over through Canada. And during the war, when America was at war with Nazi Germany, he actually found a role as with his friend Roosevelt, who by this time was president. So this guy who had been a traitor to the USA suddenly becomes an advisor to the president, having been deeply involved in the finding and the development of Hitler. Job done. He was back in the States, and he was getting his reward.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Ex-Nazis going back to work for the United States government. That doesn't.
There's nothing unusual about that, is it?
Not unusual. Crazy. Want to open it up. So if you guys want to jump in at any point of what we've discussed or going from there, Professor Spence, Matthew Arrett, Elizabeth
Guido.
Hall, Guido. What are your guys' thoughts on all this?
Could I say something quickly about paradigms? Because paradigms, as Sean Stone said, is what this is about, and controlling the paradigms is deeply important. Now, Jim and I came at this stuff. We're both from medical and scientific backgrounds. We're not historians. We don't claim to be historians. But we were looking at a bunch of facts, and we were looking at written histories, recorded histories, and none of it made sense. And as Jim alluded to, the reason none of it much makes sense is because the paradigm of history is deeply controlled, massively controlled, and it's strictly limited. It's strictly limited to available documentation. And one of the ways you can control the outcome of that is to control the documentation, either bury it or not allow it to be published or hide it or destroy it. And all of that happens. We came at it from another angle. We came at it from a scientific one where you look at the facts, you look at observable facts, you form hypotheses, you see if the hypotheses fix the known facts, how things actually happened, and then you wonder if these hypotheses can predict the future, whether you can predict the future events from the facts that you have uncovered and the hypothesis you formed about how the facts covered. And that's how we approach this. And interestingly, there is lots of evidence, lots of hard evidence in other books, including Guido's, including Sutton's, including Quigley's, but lots of other even mainstream histories where you can glean pieces of information which actually support the hypothesis. So having formed the hypothesis, in this case, the hypothesis that all this was baloney and that it had been planned and operated by a secret cabal between London and New York and other places, and Oxford, of course. And then, does that fit the facts? Yes, well, it does fit the facts. It fits the facts better than those reported by the so-called mainstream historians from Oxford. And it certainly is predictive, because it predicts future events, because much of what's happened since World War II is predicted by the events which led up to World War I and then World War II. And it all fits a common picture of how the world is actually structured and run. And this is a different way of approaching the history paradigm, to look at it from a scientific point of view rather than from the history's own narrow paradigm, which it controls, which is easily controlled, relatively easily controlled. And of course, as Sean Stone said, is you talent scout the people of the future, the historians of the future, to fit your mindset, to fit the parameter that you want them to expound, and you create national myths and narratives from that. And these are what are then used to go through the schools, and they inform the politicians, they inform the future historians, and they inform the populace at large as to what their country's about, heroism and greatness, rather than what it's really about, controlling, providing the resources to feed the monster.
Absolutely. Well, Guido, your work has been mentioned several times now at this point, alongside Carol Quigley and Anthony Sutton. So give us your insights into what we've been discussing so far.
Well, yeah, lots of things to say. I mean, we all know that science really doesn't matter in this field at all. I mean, and it's not about science or any kind of objectivity. It's about credence. And it's about, which is, we found it's the biggest obstacle. And it doesn't matter. You could have been the greatest scientist up to a certain point. You know, you think of cold fusion, a thing like that. And there are many other examples in the world of science. But if you stumble upon something that can threaten the oligarchical, parasitical nature of our system, they will, you know, you'll be demoted overnight. It doesn't matter if you were a superstar up until yesterday and you were adored, and you'll become a complete marginal non-entity the following day. And so this is, you know, and you see this in the social sciences, and what you learn is that in the Anglo-American Commonwealth, the ecclesiastical system, the church system, is its university, this articulated system, in which they take great pride. It's beautiful, you know, the campuses and all that, and it's, you know, like Rome has, you know, thousands of churches, and well, then the U.S. has thousands of colleges. It's exactly the same thing, and they beam the credences that have to be adopted in all other, in a cascade type of effect and trickling down type of effect. It doesn't matter. I mean, there was a genius in all of this, you know, beyond the Quigleys and the Suttons, and this was Thorstein Veblen, arguably the greatest social scientist, sociologist of the modern era. Nobody knows him, although, you know, his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, has classic status with Penguin. But and it's just one piece of his great production. And in my book, and as was said before, I mean, all you need to do, I mean, John was saying this, all you need to do, you don't need new facts. You don't need any kind of big revelations and sensational dossiers coming out of nowhere. All you need to do is a work of suture of the elements that are already there to rebuild the narrative and see how it is. Now, the question is, what will happen to a world that has been conditioned into thinking something else? Namely, that the Germans are the Antichrist, and the vanquishers of the Antichrist are the legions, the Anglo-American legions of God. That's the problem. It always boils down to a very simple kind of devout scenario of this kind. Now, going back to Thorstein Veblen, he writes what it's in my book. It's called The Veblenian Prophecy. It's chapter 2. So he's the greatest, and you know he's in. The funny thing is that physicists who are interested in social sciences read Veblen. It's the only one they like to read for obvious reasons. And Veblen was marginal, and he writes this review of John Maynard Keynes, you know, the Paul Krugman of his time, this kind of theatrical, this thespian of the political scene, you know, vanity incarnate, who was at the Treaty of Versailles and wrote this book, which sold and was translated into a dozen languages and sold a lot of copies. And he was this liberal, middle of the road superstar, and say, you know, poor Germans, they're going to have to pay all these reparations. This is going to be bad. Not to mention the fact that he speculated against the mark a year later and lost a lot of money. He had to ask in advance from Macmillan just to show what kind of person he was. And anyway, writes this book. The Germans loved it because they were being, you know, victimized and all that. And Veblen says this is nonsense, you know. And and he does what is really, I don't know if it's sarcastic. You never know if he's serious or not. But I mean, he uses this some kind of some kind of sarcastic doublespeak. He says, I don't understand, because Keynes was there. How could he not see that the Treaty of Versailles was just a preparation, the deliberate preparation, the setup of World War II? And he says, and he does this incredible thing. It's 5 pages long, and I keep saying it's the most beautiful piece of political economy ever written. He just says, if you want to see if they're really serious, you should have looked at what an occupying power does. It's to sequester all the financial paper, titles and the deeds of the elite and put them in a trust under foreign control and redesign the country in its own image, because Veblen was very anti-German for a while and participated into the administration, into some kind of peripheral work of the U.S. administration during the war. But after World War I, he just was so disgusted that he turned complete. He went anarchist all the way with an infatuation for Bolshevik Russia. So he says, so he didn't fully understand, but he got 95% of the story. And he says, what's going to happen is that not only are they not weakening, they're actually potentiating, because they haven't touched the elite. So what's going to come, there's going to be radicalism at home. All these changes and the turmoil they're planning is going to affect the middle strata. They're going to go behind a revanchist movement that's going to come back and will be reorganizing a reconstructed Germany with the help of the elder statesmen of the West to be launched against the Bolshevik regime. And so I read this piece. This was written in 1920. One of the most extraordinary documents. I'm the only one who cites it. And I don't know why. I mean, and I probably have said this many other times in many other contexts. And it's extraordinary. So he predicts Barbarossa with an anticipation of 20 years. So once you see it in this key, you understand how de facto the Weimar, that the game was already lost by World War I. But when the Americans came onto the scene, the Germans signed a peace, of course, but they had to be razed to the ground. And so this is why I call the Weimar Republic an incubator. And this is what it does. But it's an artificial synthetic system, and there's no longer any Germany to speak of. And for me, the most interesting thing is that finally, after they had toppled every other empire, as has been said in the other podcasts, the British, they had to do what they had to do, because when they saw this thing coming out of nowhere that was Germany, they had to act fast. They were even building a navy. So they thought, what are they thinking? This is a matter of life and death for our imperial imperatives. And so they got rid of Russia. They got rid of the Ottoman Empire. They gave a big jolt to the Vatican, because the divisions of the Vatican were the Austrians, but they will take over the Vatican later, as I tell in another book. And so they remained, and everything else was conquered. There remained this problem at the heart of Eurasia. Russia, most important story, never told. There's so many elements of that story that are not in the history books. The Civil War, incredible. You can see from, and I said one of the most extraordinary thing is the role of the British, of military intelligence. They have a handful of men, and I don't know if I've said this before. I don't want to repeat myself, and I'm always been amazed by just the complete easiness and flair with which these few men, with a few brigades, move along the entire stretch of the Eurasian landmass, where all these carnages are going on in a very complex, all sorts of theaters of war. We think nowadays the situation is complex, nothing compared to then, and just orchestrating things in such a way that the whites, who on paper were the allies, make sure they would defeat it, and handing over half of the world to the Bolsheviks, who were just some kind of an ISIS group de facto. So if you want to read the key to Putin in all this story, it's right there. That country is pretty much on loan, as is the whole Middle East. It's British. So then the most important story of the Russians is the Tukhachevsky. Their number one, their military, their number one fighter, saw all of this coming. And the famous trip, see there, and I tell this story. I found it in a book by Benoit Méchain, who was a historian that was a politician in the Vichy regime, and I was amazed that I couldn't see it anywhere else. It's extraordinary, And he understands what's happening in the mid-30s, and he flies to Paris, he flies to London, and he's rebuffed. They say, leave us alone, go away. He goes home and he sees Stalin and Molotov being really appeasing towards the Nazis, because that's the other part nobody talks about. Not just the British and the whole world and the American are supplying Germany, rearming the Golem, but the Russians are too. Past Barbarossa. Amazing. And this is documented. Tukhachevsky knew what was up, that there was a deal between England and Russia was going to take the brunt on its flesh of that attack that Veblen had predicted, alone on a review on a journal that nobody read. I mean, him and his aunt, and that was about it. I'm joking. I don't know if his aunt read it, but and Tukhachevsky, of course, goes there, protests, and so Stalin, what does Stalin do? He starts the purges, kills him and his deputy Putna, and about 1,500. He decapitates the Red Army, all those faithful to Tukhachevsky, so that he can play this game. And then, and I'm going to stop because I spoke a lot, but I'm thinking, and all of that ushers into George Orwell's 1984, and this is the world we live in, where finally all of the cards, as I keep saying, all of the cards in the deck are in the same hands, and the world we live in is a world of spectacle, of fog and shadows, and because it has to be so, it's an eternal TV show, because they're forced. The Anglo-Americans are forced to do this because you gotta keep the show going. There are no enemies left. So, but you gotta keep these war games going, and this is everything that Orwell predicted. So.
Thank you, Guido. I saw a lot of people taking notes on all that. That's fantastic stuff. Matt, I know you have a lecture to go to at the top of the hour. I'd like to get you on the record here. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it pains me that I have to depart in 10 minutes, but thanks for letting me chime in before I go. And thank you, everybody. Guido, I just got a quick question for you. In your work, because Verlaine did come up a little bit in my research for a few books that I recently published, and it wasn't looking super peachy what I was looking at. Specifically, I have a question for you regarding Howard Scott, the founder of Technocracy, Inc., who was a student at New School under Verblaine's technical alliance operation, who seems to have taken a lot of Verblaine's ideas of the Soviet of engineers that would reorganize or reset civilization by a controlled sort of shutting down of production in order to sort of create a new elite that would then reemerge out of the ashes under a collective that would have subgroups, sub-councils that would micromanage on the subdomain of regions of the world. That seems like Howard Scott took a lot of that stuff into his Technocracy, Inc., which Joshua Haldeman, Elon's grandfather, who was working with a bunch of Fabians, Oxford Rhodes Scholars when he was running the Saskatchewan Fabian Society, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. He was studying a lot of this and really got recruited by Howard Scott's concepts when he became the head of the Technocracy, Inc. in 1936 and got thrown in jail for having fascist proclivities at that time, and also, just generally just being pro-eugenics. And I was wondering if you took an angle in your research of Verlaine that looked at a little bit more of those components of the story that might tie in a little bit to today's picture of the sort of setting up of a new set of elites that are vetted to replace the old set that are, some of them are holding on to old ways. So did you look at that stuff?
No, I don't know about these. I don't know. It's Veblen, by the way. I don't know about these successors you mentioned. It's interesting. I'll definitely look.
Okay.
Is Councils of Engineers. It's out of his book, The Engineers and the Price System. It's a booklet. It's not deep enough. I mean, it's not deep at all. It's an anarchist project. It's kind of a dream utopia where he imagines cities just governed by what I imagine will be foundations with their engineers and physicists being the key elements who can provide solutions for cheap energy, that kind of things, and no reduction. No, there is no reduction of production, it's a very bland kind of a dream book, and he himself realizes the naivety of it, and saying, well, I really hope that the rich will divest themselves of their wealth so we can move forward with this. But he knows it's not going to happen. But it stops there. And he dies in complete obscurity alone in a shack in Menlo Park. So I don't know what these others have done with his stuff and have taken it to sinister lengths. But him, it was not like that.
Yeah, that's a relief. So it seems like maybe Howard Scott might have done some creative twisting on his ideas when he set up his shop. Okay. Well, yeah, I just want to, thank you for that. And as far as the remarks by John O'Dowd, the idea of scientific method, I think it speaks really deeply to me as well. And there's not a single agreement when we use the word science. A lot of people don't mean the same thing, but I like your approach to it because when you're dealing with human history, there are problems that have been built into the sort of filters, the polarized lenses of the mind that have been put onto us through the conditioning that a lot of historians go through in school. Oh, sorry, John. Yeah, what's up?
No, can I just say though, thanks for the comments, but I came across Veblen about 30 odd years ago when I was doing my MBA, and he struck me immediately as being a guy who understood the scientific method from as how I understood it, because he was a guy who started with observing what was there, what was to be seen, and then formulating theories derived on that. And then that's what I think gave him his great insight, which Guido spoke about, his ability, his predictive ability, apart from having a brilliant mind and a huge education. He looked at things, he studied things, he formed patterns, he understood the patterns, and he used those to predict or to formulate theories which still stand the test. He's worth a read. This guy's worth a read. His writing style can be a bit opaque and difficult, but he's worth a read. He really is.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that idea of having a predictive power into the future, that gives us an ability to influence things for the better, because obviously there's a lot of sick, bad ideas that are driving society, nudging it in a very bad direction that's not...
Or for the worse.
Oh, yeah. So if we're actually looking at these patterns that repeat throughout history based on certain common principles premised around human nature being what it is, then the idea of history is that, you have a battle over different ideas of what the future should be. Hence, the history in that sense becomes different, the effect of different competing concepts of what futures should be brought into being that organize the behavior, the planning, the outcomes in different systems. And then you wonder why people don't see a lot of these plans, because they're told, oh, conspiracy theories, that's touching on the realm of ideas of purposefulness, that's metaphysics that has no role to play in hard facts. So you see that there is this radical positivism that's been introduced into the framework of standard model historical responsible studies that prevent people from appreciating that people do conspire around ideas, good or bad, and that do things according to that and apply power if they have that power to better ever increasingly bring about those outcomes. But if you don't believe in ideas and you don't believe in the knowability of intentions or conspiracies, then you might just fall prey to those lies that have been fed into the school system over the last, especially since JFK was killed, that conspiracy theories are a sign of a mental dysfunction. Whereas in reality, that's the only way to know anything about human history, is to look for good or for bad conspiracies. And then if you do that well enough and you generate good hypotheses that get you towards a causal nexus, you can start seeing many of those same patterns repeat in the society that you're located in, which then gives you an ability with that knowledge to then play a role in a varying degree of amplitudes in influencing for the better, something that might prevent us from becoming a really tragic fascist-run society of feudal serfs. So I just wanted to thank everybody for that, and I want to share my general philosophy as well that I think resonates, or not. I think it definitely resonates with John and what Guido you were saying, and as I read more Veblen, I'll hopefully find more and more of that and make it knowledge in my own mind that what Howard Scott did and Elon Musk's grandfather did with his concepts is actually more of a perversion rather than a loyalty to those real ideas. So thank you guys for all of that.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it, man. Good luck with your lecture. So I want to get Professor Spence on the record here. And then, of course, I saw Richard Grove with the history blueprint getting queued up there. So I'm very curious what you got cooking. But Professor Spence, what are your thoughts on everything we've been discussing here?
Ooh, everything. Well, a lot has been discussed. I don't know. Maybe I'll go back a little ways. And there was this, being one of those professional historians, whatever that means. So how do you construct history? There was some talk earlier about primary sources. Primary sources are the main thing about anything in print is that you've got something which is real. That is, a document is a thing that you can touch, you can read it, you can do any number of things with it. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything in that document is true. That's something which is completely another issue. But you've got something. So one of the things, for instance, in research I do, just looking for information, is to go through old newspapers and look at when some event happens. One of the things to go through is to go back and look at when was the first time something was mentioned? When was the story first told? And it doesn't mean that that story holds up over time. It doesn't mean that the story is any more accurate than, but it's the first version that comes out. And then what you get are these kind of increasing iterations of it. The story begins to change over time and more information is added. Some of that information may be true and some of it may not be. So primary sources are imperfect. They can be nothing more than a lie on paper. But what still gives them value, in the same way that an old newspaper article could be largely the creation of journalistic imagination, but it's something as opposed to everything else you have, which is that somebody said this. That's it. You've got primary sources or you've got hearsay. And even the primary sources themselves may be based upon that. And then you've got the other thing that you have to throw into it is that people lie constantly about all kinds of things for all sorts of reasons. In fact, that's one of the things that I've found that, if you can figure out why the person is lying, then you can kind of deconstruct the lie. What is it that they're lying about? What is it that they're trying to obscure? But the ones that are really mystifying, the ones that will keep you up at night in some ways, is when people lie for no particular reason. They simply make up a story, or they construct a narrative, or they provide disinformation almost as a matter of entertainment. And in fact, I ran across a fellow. There is a British writer, kind of an establishment writer, sort of in the fringes of it, usually runs under the name of Richard Deacon. You go out and find his books. He wrote a lot on intelligence and different issues. He would write the histories of intelligence services that he actually knew nothing about. Richard Deacon, his real name was Donald McCormick. And Donald McCormick was kind of a bane of my existence for a while because I would try to run down things that he had mentioned in his books. And his books are often this, he would be talking about real people in real situations, and then he would just make things up. I mean, this is a guy who wouldn't just make up documents in an archive and say they were there. He would make up entire archives that didn't exist. So you could go looking for an archive that didn't exist, for a dossier of materials that didn't exist. And I eventually got a chance, sort of in his dotage, to have a brief conversation with him where I was trying to pry information out of him because I still thought he knew something. And he basically made a kind of interesting admission, was that, I sort of made these things up because it amused me to make them up. So that in a way that people like you would just go around wasting your time trying to find stuff that didn't exist. So there's always this creation of, history is just people making up stories. What it comes into, you got a few basic facts about things. All right. I mean, let's take what the real conversation here is about. The First World War and the Second World War happened. I think we can pretty much agree upon that. There was a thing that we call World War II. There was a lot of violence, military campaigns. You can go through and you can trace them. So World War II is a real thing. It's not made up. But then you come to the key question that Jim and John get to is that why did it happen? You can see that this thing took place. Why did it happen? Yeah, it's like coming across a dead body. Okay, you've got a dead body, it's there. Well, who was this person? How were they killed? Why were they killed? Was this an accident? Was it murder? Those are all the kinds of questions that one comes across. So the really important questions is why. And I think it's the approach of sort of putting aside what everyone else has said about it and taking a fresh look, I think is basically what Jim and John have done. I'm oversimplifying that in a way, but I think when they're taking the scientific approach, all right, let's sort of cut all of the dissonance which is going on, everything that we've been told, and all the contradictions about it. Because that's one of the things you would find. If you look even in terms of what's called the standard history of the world wars, you won't find agreement on everything. You'll find a whole variety of different competing narratives. There may be a kind of thread that runs through them. But one of the things you'll get out of it, if you were to read everything that had been written on World War II, and you were to take it all to heart, you would be confused. There is no coherent answer to anything. There's a mass of opinion about what things mean. So putting aside, not forgetting about it, using it as a source of reference, but no longer believing it, no longer using it as a starting point and going back. It's a bit like the old ideas that we should pay most attention to is what people do, not what they say. So let's just look at what happened, put the voices and opinion aside, and try to go back and reconstruct things from that point. What seems to make sense about this? And I'm not sure that there's any perfect way to do that. I wouldn't say that necessary that two world wars and Hitler has to be perfect in its interpretation, but it's certainly better, I think, that things have gone previously. It is an important step in the right direction, which unfortunately means that it will always struggle to be recognized because it's not telling the story that people would expect to have. And people don't like it when you change narratives on them. Because then they have to start questioning everything. If Hitler wasn't the Antichrist, then I don't know, maybe there's no God. What are we going to do? Once you start questioning one part of it, the rest of it, everything else can kind of unravel. People are very uncomfortable about having their realities, however falsely those may be based, however much of a myth they may be, unravel in front of them. So I think it's an uphill struggle. I think it's a very important contribution, but is it immediately going to change everything? Is it going to sweep aside all of the other narratives? No. Those have a tremendous power behind them. They are, at least some of them, are the establishment narrative. And this is basically what we seem to have been talking about, have been talking around, is that in some ways, the world wars of the 20th century are only a symptom of something greater. They are a symptom of a method of control. So there are always two aspects to anything. You look at anything. There is the exoteric, what you see, what is presented to you, what's visible, and there is the esoteric. There is that which is hidden, that which exists behind the scenes. And you tend to find this out in just about anything you go into. You'll find it in the military, you'll find it in business, you certainly find it in academia. This is the way things are supposed to be. These are the rules. This is the system. But then you find out little by little that, well, there are shortcuts around these things. This is the way it's supposed to work. But this is the way that it really works. This is how the system actually functions, which is nothing like, or only very vague reference to what exists in the rule books. So there's all those rules that you're supposed to follow, all of these different things that have been made up. But if you know the right people or you're in the right situation, you can get around all of those things. You can find that. And this is one of the things that would strike me in academia, is that there were very strict rules about hiring. All right. This was, you had to go through this. Hiring in academia is like a constant audition for something. You have to bring a certain number of people, there have to be interviews and all the rest of this. And that all is true until there's someone that we really want to hire and we don't want to go through this rigmarole, so we'll just do it otherwise. There was a thing called, I'll give you an example of this, spousal accommodation in academic hiring. And this is where a department, college, the university really wants to hire a person. They really want this person for one reason or another. But this person says that, well, I married somebody else who's also an historian. And if you're going to get me, they have to have a job as well. So I would get this as the chair of a department. We're going to hire this person. And we want you and your department to give the person they're sleeping with a job. That's why they're getting the job. It all depends who their sexual partner is, and everything else aside, their qualifications, the rest of it, we don't know. We want this person, so you have to give this person a job. And this is without any of the other sort of rigmarole and vetting that anyone else had to go through. So there are always these exceptions. There's the way the world is supposed to work, the way they are told it to work, and then there's the way that it actually does. And often we're just sort of flummoxed by that whenever we encounter it. But if you keep encountering it enough, then you realize that's the way the world actually works. That is the true picture. It isn't the exception to the rule, it's the rule, the hidden rules, the things that are always there. And then you get these people, you're mentioning Ernst Putzi Handstengel he's one of these characters who they play a role on the historical stage, but it's very difficult to figure out why. I mean, this guy just sort of bops in, he's well connected. That's the thing to note about him. He's well connected in Germany and in America. He knows the right people. I mean, when you go to Harvard with FDR, you know the right people. That's what counts, okay? It's not anything else he did. It's who he knows. And, waltzes back over to Germany for no particular reason, becomes a confidant and friend to Hitler, and is in that role for years. And then all of a sudden, he isn't, and he switches, and he goes somewhere else. And you'll encounter these people. Hanfstengel is an example of that. Colonel Edward Mandell House, the advisor, the sort of Svengali or Rasputin of Woodrow Wilson, is an example of that. A fellow by the name of Josef Rettinger, a Polish political adventurer, who's the actual founder of the Bilderberg Group, which no one ever tends to mention, is another example of it. These are people who are never elected to anything. They sort of move in and out of the positions of power for reasons that are never entirely clear. So are they just kind of crazy individuals who just get lucky, or are they a glimpse into this kind of parallel power structure? They're in the positions they're in because someone else put them into those positions. I'll give you one more example, then I'll shut up. Another person I was talking about recently in another context was a fellow by the name of Basil Zaharoff. Early 20th century arms salesman. That's all apparently he was. He became the preeminent arms salesman for the British firm Vickers and others. He had, Hiram Maxim, the Nordenfelt Company. And he made himself a billionaire by selling lots of arms. And Zaharoff knew that if you're going to sell weapons and munitions, you don't just sell them to one side, you sell them to both sides. And furthermore, since war is money, one of the ways that you promote business, if you're in the arms business, is to promote wars. It's to your financial advantage to do these things. So Zaharov is, again, one of these people who you can't really tell where he comes from. His ethnicity is never entirely clear, but he's steadily he's someone who begins from nowhere, but he steadily advances into this position of great wealth. But more important than his money is the influence that he has. So, towards the end of the First World War, the British government approach Basil Zaharov, and they want him to be the go-between in a plan to bribe the Ottoman Turks out of the war, to get them to conclude an armistice, which they eventually do. And the interesting thing about it, and you can find, the documentation is in the David Lloyd George papers. He was the British Prime Minister at the time. Is that the British government, the most powerful political entity on the earth at that point in time, they don't tell Zaharov, we want you to take 600,000 pounds and pay Turks in Switzerland to go out of the war. They ask him, they virtually beg him to do this. And he at one point just says, they wanted him initially to sort of put up his own money, so it wouldn't look like it came from us. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to walk away from the whole thing. And they're again, they don't order him. They don't command him. They're almost as if they're suppliants asking his help in this situation. So you got to come up with an interesting question. Who the hell is this guy? How did someone who started from nothing get into a position in which, in the midst of a war, the British imperial government begs his assistance in a backdoor political deal? I don't know. I'm not sure that anybody else does, but there is it's a glimpse again into this whole esoteric power structure, the way the world actually runs. And it's not run by the people that you think it's run by for the reasons that you think it's run by. And the whole thing is disguised in a massive narrative, most of which is lies.
There you go. There you go. All right. Well, I know that some people are up against the clock here. I wanted to toss it back over to Richard Grove, and then we're going to give it to Sean Stone for the final words. And then, of course, I'm going to definitely call on Paul and Elizabeth next, and we're gonna taxi towards the runway here. So, Richard, what do you think here?
I think there's a certain strength to Rick's point there about people don't like when their favorite narratives are changed. We are taught about the origins of World War One, and then you read some books or you watch a World War One conspiracy by Corbett, and you start thinking, maybe history is not being done by the people in the positions of power you see. Maybe history is being done by the private papers of Colonel House juxtaposed to the private papers of Lord Grey. And there's some cunning individuals who aren't really elected to power that are making decisions and then informing, hey, the king, we're going to have maybe the Lusitania sink, or, the narrative about World War II. The why and the how and the who are all very interesting questions. Why did America get into World War II? Because we could go to World War I and talk about the Balfour Declaration, but I'll set that aside. Let's go to World War II. Why did we get in? Pearl Harbor. When I have private papers, going back to primary artifacts, the memoirs of the chief of MI6, John Cecil Masterman, he says in there, they had the questionnaires for Pearl Harbor and the attack in August of 1941, but they didn't want to tell the Americans because the relationship was new. And if we, the Americans, knew how much extensive spying and espionage they were participating in, we might not wanted to have been on their side that war. A third of American population, by the way, in World War I was German. So there was a huge propaganda campaign to get us to go to war with Germany in the first place. World War II is another aspect. Now, I didn't mention the Balfour Declaration because I wanted to go maybe 90 years back in history before that. This is an example of a primary piece of evidence. And to Rick's point, before I explain this thing exists. I know the person who owns it. He's a friend of ours. This piece of Journalism from 1829 may express lies. The entirety of this whole thing might be rumor, innuendo, hyperbole, any of these things. But the point is, this artifact exists and it must be dealt with on timelines when trying to understand World War One, World War Two, the world today, as a matter of fact. And it comes from November 28th, 1829. And it says, there is a report that the Rothschilds have purchased Jerusalem. We see nothing improbable in that. In the pecuniary distress, the monetary distress of the Sultan, with more and more ending with the Sultan is in great difficulty. Baron Rothschild was proceeding to Constantinople, and the second building of a temple is not among the most strange things expected in these strange times by some of the Jews. Now, that's an American newspaper, 1829, Niles Weekly Register. You can go read more archives. There's ones from the 1830s. There's a whole bunch of these things. And I would say, maybe those are made up rumors, except in the 1880s, the Rothschilds start colonizing. By the time you get to the 1920s through the 1940s, they're actively, between a French and British banking consortium, setting up their own nation state, which then acquires nuclear weapons soon after World War II. So there's a lot of these pieces, and unless we actually get involved in trying to understand and ask the question, where are the pieces of evidence and what might we learn from them, we're never going to survive into the future with any type of freedom, accepting the official narratives offered by the people doing the things that take away our freedom. So that's just, me agreeing with Rick.
That's awesome. Yeah. Right on. Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Richard, if you need to go, man, I know you had a time constraint. You want to tell
me?
Yeah,
I've got a 3:30. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to watching the rest of this with my esteemed colleagues. I thank you all for inviting me and letting me be part of this event.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. And yes, of course, you can find more of him at grandtheftworld.com and richardgrove.org. Sean, I want to kick it to you for your final words, because I know you have to mosey on out of here as well. So any final thoughts on any of the topics discussed? Just so much to go with here.
So much to discuss. And I mean, what an amazing group of people to sit with. I wish I had the hours. I actually have another interview to do. But I think just in terms of Professor Spence's point here about the establishment, and yeah, it's very interesting how this stuff works when you get, start to get glimpse it, right? When you actually, going back to the JFK film that was done in 91, and I was, reference how the media came after, the film even before it was released, leaking an early draft of the script to already basically denounce it as, fake history, and then, thereafter to say it was a fantasy. And to this day, there's plenty of, these people that will, blindly, just without even analyzing the evidence. I think ABC just did another piece, still reiterating the magic bullet theory could be proved in a computer simulation, right? So it must be valid. So they're still unwilling to look at the forensics, to look at, just the evidence of what's clearly an operation, right? Even if we don't know the ultimate who, we know that the operation, how do you say, we know that the story of Oswald killing Kennedy doesn't add up, right? So there's an establishment that's at work, and it's larger than government officials. It's larger than, it intersects with the private sector, it intersects with media, it intersects with colleges, with the business, obviously big business sector, international conglomerates. And this is just something that I've certainly tried to explore and expose, and as everyone here has in our different avenues. In my case, more with documentary work. The latest documentary I did was actually RFK Legacy, and how the establishment not only killed JFK but RFK, which is an equally obvious conspiracy. Again, when you look at the forensics, which was all the bullets that entered RFK came from behind, and as close as about as 1 to 3 inches from the back of his head. So it doesn't add up. And yet here we are, living on with these fantasies and the collective fantasies that even when people say, yeah, I believe in conspiracies, but we're not allowed to publicly have these discourses, right? And that's what the power of the establishment is. The fact that we have these roundtables and we have, people like ourselves doing this. But listen, I haven't been invited on CNN since I told Piers Morgan he was a warmonger, 13 years ago, right? So it's like you get to that place where you basically run up, and because your paradigm, again, because you're an independent thinker and because you don't play by their rules, right? You are kind of outside of the system. And so that's, I guess where we are currently is having these conversations outside the system. But thankfully, I do trust that there is an awakening that's ongoing. Um, because again, I think COVID was that moment. Remember, so when Professor Spence mentioned the nature of war and how the world wars were used for, essentially for controlling people. I go back to the line in JFK, which I think was sourced from the report from Iron Mountain, which we don't know if it was a real document or not, but certainly there's a lot of great information. And one of the great lines is the organizing principle of a society is for war. And you think about that, that's what's consistently deployed, at least, in the United States, if not elsewhere, is the war powers, right? So whether it's the war powers of perpetual war against a phantom menace, like the war on terror was, or the phantom menace of COVID, which opened up a whole other range of, again, printing of money, right? You've got to borrow, you have to exert all kinds of federal power and influence, right? In a war state. COVID allowed for the same measures and again expanded it now because the enemy became even the domestic population, right? The unvaccinated, the unmasked, whatever. So the organizing principle of war continues, but people now, I think, because of that, have started to really wake up. And I do have this optimism that because obviously, yes, we're not in a coherent state of how to advance or how to reveal the conspiracies that we know exist, but at least we have the outlets and the channels now through social media, through alternative platforms and whatnot, to have these conversations and to ultimately undermine the legacy media as a result. And I think that's really, in a way, these moments now where Netflix buying HBO or whatever, Paramount or Netflix, the Ellisons, whatever, whoever buys it, to me, it's like the more you see consolidation of corporations, that to me is the death knell of them because ultimately it's like that means that they're in so much trouble that they need to be bought by bigger and bigger entities, and they're in trouble because people are now turning to the alternative sources for media for for their attention, for their ideas and thoughts. And I think so really if we compare where we are now compared to like post World War II 1950 with like what 4 or 5 6 channels, right, which were all basically vestiges of the OSS new CIA, control structure, right, for disseminating information, we're in a very good place for being able to have these conversations, hopefully wake up the next generations, and eventually reveal these conspirators, because it's really just a question of choices that people make, right? To say, do we want to live with whatever, an Epstein style of pedophilia and blackmail going on in our systems of power, or have we had enough with these sociopaths? Again, the ones that lie for the pleasure of lying and deceiving because they feel they can get away with it. So again, here I just say, here's to the great awakening, and may it continue.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sean. Really appreciate it.
Got it.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.
I'd like to introduce Paul and
That's what I was going to
Liz
say.
here.
That's what I say. We have this ragtag group that we've been assembling in all these episodes, right? And the audience is now familiar with all of them. But we are now joined by Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. So yes, welcome. Please introduce yourselves and maybe tell us a little bit about where you see all this going.
Let me talk just a little bit, because I've been working with Paul and Liz now for about 4 years on a roundtable where we're talking about JFK's vision of peace. Okay, and you can't have peace without justice. Okay, and so we've really explored that. And see, Paul is a Fitzgerald, and they're related to Honey Fitz, who was Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy's father. Okay, and talking about the predictive things that Guido was talking about and John was talking about. I mean, in these roundtables, because I would go to the JFK conferences and I would say, hey, some of the ducks were put in a row before Kennedy was even elected, and people would say, hey, that crazy hippie, get him out of here. But the more we've looked into it, you can see where there's this secret societal structure that has been around for quite a while, Okay. And at one point in time, a secret societal will rise up against something and maybe another one. Well, after a while, they become, cognizant of each other, and they'll say, hey, let's work together because our common enemy is the people. That's who we have to befuddle and control. Okay. And Paul has been, uh, he was an established journalist, worked with Dan Rather and lots of people, and found out that he brought them the real deal, and they didn't want the real deal. Of course, they wanted the stilted version that they could use to control. But we've in these discussions that we've had in this other roundtable, we've come across, predictive programming that goes back to John Dee and the establishment of the British Empire. And so there's a long history and a long narrative of how the world really works. And it's I'll let Paul and Liz tell a little bit here.
We've spent a lot of time, as Chris pointed out, we spent a lot of time kind of digging into the origins of some of these things, and you get these bits and pieces that just come up out of nowhere. You say, what the heck has this got to do with that story? Okay. And so that's kind of where we started out. We started out with Afghanistan, but you could start with World War II, you could start with World War I, you could start with the Crusades. And I think that's kind of where we've wound up, was with the Crusades. But when you look at the Middle East strategy, and it comes down to there's a lot of stuff that connects to rebuilding the Temple of Jerusalem, and it's connected to the murder of Thomas Becket in 1170. It's connected to the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1170. You have all these coincidental things that say, well, gee, there's a lot of coincidences hanging over here. And then all of a sudden you think, well, I could make a pair of socks out of these coincidences. And then you realize it's getting bigger than a pair of socks. It's getting to be a blanket. And then you look at it and you look under the blanket and you've got all these conspirators under there that are doing all these different things. And you begin to realize there's whole other dimensions out there that you're missing. And so we just finished reading a new book by Alfred McCoy, speaking of this kind of thing. And Alfred McCoy did The Politics of Heroin, and he kind of set an example that a lot of young men followed and women followed. And one thing is, it's amazing for him to look back at that origin back in the 1960s. And he says in the book that he said it became a mystical experience for him when he looked back at his original experiences interviewing all of these high-level people at the CIA and meeting the drug dealers and the kind of stuff that was going on and what he was wrestling with back in those days, and how when he looked back at it, he said it was just like it was a revelation. It was revelatory to him to see how different things really were. But he focused in on the fact that there were all these individual actors out there that were not, as you mentioned before. How did Patsy get involved in this? What was he doing there? Basil Zaharov, what was Basil Zaharov doing? And Sidney Riley as working for Basil Zaharov and with Basil Zaharov. Who were these people? How did they get involved in this? And that's one of the things that that Alfred picks up on in this issue, is that that there are people, the Lawrence of Arabia, there are Gordon Pasha in Egypt. How did they wind up in the middle of this thing and become movers and shakers in a global movement that eventually they're like the submarines that wandered into a situation, shot off a few torpedoes, and then the ocean comes back in and goes about normal as usual, and you don't see anything. It's very calm on the surface, but there's all this other stuff going on underneath. So we discovered that with in terms of John Dee as an example. He's more, the more you dig into the history that we've dug into of the Fitzgerald family, you wind up discovering that there are all these ancillary aspects to it. But the numerology of it is what really caught our eye. That we started seeing numbers showing up again and again and again. And these numbers turned out to be more interesting than we had ever imagined. As an example, take 3 sets of numbers. It's the same number. It happened in 1307, November 22nd. It happened in 1583, November 22nd, and it happened in 1963, November 22nd. What did all these things have to do with each other? They have, what to do with each other was the building of an empire, a sacred empire. And that was the subcutaneous process going on that we kept going under. As I said, like we're in a submarine and we kept bumping into this thing underwater, but not knowing what it was. And then Al McCoy points out the same thing when he said, all these people get involved in these things. And he met a lot of them in his travels in the drug dealing world. And he said, these are people you never hear about. These are people who just wander in. And he said, what he was amazed was the fact that the same people showed up in all these different places again and again and again. And he said they were French, they were Italian, they were British, they were South African. He said they all just kind of had the same thing. And he said they all knew what they were doing. They were all given authority. The major authorities, the mainstream authorities, just simply sat back and let them do what they wanted to do. And then they went away. They overthrew a government. They killed a few people here. They killed a few people there. They installed people here. They installed people there. And he said, and then they just faded back into the background. So that's where your mystical imperialism comes in. And that's what we discovered about JFK and his connection to it. And it just happens to be personal and family oriented to me. But I mean, I got pulled into it directly. I had no intention of doing it. I had no intention of looking at that stuff. And but what caught my eye was a number. The number was 117. And it was the room number of the Cabell Hotel. And the number 117 just kept showing up and showing up and showing up. And it was the Cabell Hotel in which the American ambassador, Adolph Dubs, was executed by probably a Cabell policeman who was in league with the DEA back in 1979. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Carter administration's national security advisor, took full advantage of it and simply used it as an example of how brutal the Soviets were. And it was another reason why we had to basically renew the Cold War and go back to war again, once again. So the war is the natural state of things, and that was the particular impetus at that time. But there's a whole, once again, there's another mathematical connection to that, and that mathematical connection had a lot to do with the Elizabethan era and the politics of somebody named John Dee. Liz?
I would just like to add, now that Paul mentioned these 3 dates, 1307, 1583, and 1963, that is exactly what when you put those 3 numbers together and you realize they are directly connected to the assassination date of JFK, that there is an actual history involved, and that the motivation that even to this day there are people in this country who justify the assassination of JFK, because we've heard from them because of the writing we do, that they had to kill JFK. This country was created by people who needed to defend themselves against Rome, and he represented Rome. And that is still heard today. So I think that this is all part of this layer of beliefs that are out there that are phenomenally influential, but that people have been so distanced from them, and they can't even take it seriously, and it's still running, very much running our world. And the fact is, when it comes to imperialism, mystical is a very important component. In fact, the term mystical imperialism was created for Cecil Rhodes in the 19th century to describe how powerful he was. And that today, many people would believe has nothing at all to do with existence itself.
Amen. Amen.
Fascinating. Very fascinating. Thank you both for joining us and sharing all that. That's very unique perspective and super, super valuable. So we're gonna go to final thoughts, you guys. We're just gonna do final thoughts and just kind of land on the runway here for this series. So I'm gonna shoot it over to Guido. Guido, what are your final thoughts on all this?
Final thoughts. Well, I can't believe we reached the end already. I don't know. I think it's a good opportunity, as I keep saying to everybody and all the friends, that maybe it's about time that we build something across the Atlantic where we can meet and create a counter story, maybe. And I don't know, maybe a concrete project would be good with just a venue, and maybe we can, you know, create a school and create that exchange to create a movement, as I keep saying, which is what the fact that we're still it's not that there's few of us. I think there's quite a lot of us, but we're not united yet. And so we're not able to give body to a story that can, which is a story which debunks the one that's told. And as has been said in the course of this discussion, it's a story, the only story they teach, it's a story that is exclusively based on violence of one form or another. They say that cooperation is good, but they don't teach us to cooperate. Since school, they teach us to compete. And it gets worse and worse and worse. And I just realized that the only idiom and all these stories, it doesn't matter which one it is, the Nazis or not the Nazis, it's always a story about bullying and prepotence and imposing one's will over the other and displacing. It's always about violence, and it's the only language that exists and the only one that is recognized and people are resigned to. Even for the future they hope for their kids, it's like, you got to get a safe job so you can find a good place in this beehive, this mechanical beehive we live in, so you can secure one of the best combs, and so the story we tell is a story where we say no to all of this. It's not, our natural state is not fighting and non-cooperating and war. It's the opposite of this. And you may say this is really tried, but actually it's very bold, because as soon as you start talking about mutualism and cooperation and rethinking everything, people think, oh my God, this is too much. But no, I think, and so maybe it's time that there's a lot of, I know in the US there's a lot of demand for change in Europe as well. And I think endeavors such as the one you've promoted with this roundtable could just transcend the particular topics and everything and just move towards and go towards a movement, a cooperative movement worldwide, starting with us through Europe and the States. Doesn't have to be political, but a movement of ideas and of people across the Atlantic to create a counter story to all these things that we're seeing that are just just are noxious for the race as a whole, I think.
Wow, I love that. You're really speaking my language with that. That's something to explore. And honestly, what struck me is like, yeah, it would be nice to work up to having like a brick and mortar building, but we live in this age where we could create something like that digitally, like some sort of
virtual
academy, some sort of virtual academy or something like that with curriculum and all kinds of things. So this is something we should definitely discuss, because this is something I'm passionate about as well. And I have lots of people in my network that have already done similar things, like homeschooling curriculum, stuff like that. So, more geared towards kids, but and then Richard Grove, who was here, he teaches his autonomy course is literally about teaching adults how to break out of their mental prison from public education, from, the 9-to-5 mindset where it's like, I have to have a 9-to-5 job. I don't even know how I would start a business, like all these things. So
Yeah.
there's potential there. There's people in our network that do that. So let's talk more. Love to talk to you more about that. So,
Super.
but that is, you know, if we don't take this knowledge and then do something with it, you know, and then to enrich. And I know, you know, as authors, as podcasters, as content creators, as historians, like the idea is that we give the world this information with the hopes that they will take it and improve upon their own ability to level up in the world, right? To have a better understanding of the world around them. You know, that's why we're so passionate about giving information to people. Myself as a podcaster, all of you as authors and historians, you know, that is the reason why. I mean, at least I speak for myself. That's really why I feel so motivated to give people this information and to allow them to then take it and run with it. And so if we can give people then, when they're in that attitude of, okay, now I'm going to run with it, if we can give them a place to funnel that energy back to then elevate themselves and everyone else, I love that. So I think that's a great philosophy.
Yeah, and I would like to add one thing. I finally met Jim, and I met one another. I went to see him in Budapest, where he had a tremendous success. I mean, he was crowds, adoring crowds, and so yeah, so it's all over the world, and I witnessed that, and it was really sensational. So there is potential. There is potential, huge potential.
That's amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Guido, for joining us on every episode. I think there's a few people here who win the badge every episode award. So that's fantastic. So
Thank you.
speaking of the every episode award, Professor Richard Spence, what are your final thoughts on all this? Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go. All right. I managed to do that. Well, keep it simple. Go back to what I said before. Pay attention to what people do, not so much to what they say. Listen to what they say. Don't necessarily believe it. And don't get stampeded into things, which is easy to do. I think that if there was anything, I would say that the COVID experience taught to me is that of just seeing how many people that appeared to be perfectly reasonable, sane people I thought the day before were now being completely stampeded into some kind of mass psychosis. And it's the situation where you try to figure out either I'm going insane or everyone else is. And I would kind of hope it was me, because it would just be one, because the alternative to that is really scary. These people are just the world is an uncertain place. Truth is an uncertain thing. It takes a constant effort to try to negotiate that. So pay attention to what they do, not so much to what they say.
Exactly. That's their job, is to tell you one thing, and while they're over here doing something else, it's like the misdirection. It's like every magician, they get your attention focused here while they're doing the
It's interesting you mentioned the word magician, because in a more
sorcerer,
in a more metaphysical aspect, there are those who argue that words cast spells.
Spelling.
Well, that's what have you ever heard people who can talk people into things? I say that I have talked people into things. I will confess, on certain occasions, nothing really bad. I was able to, through the magic of words, get people to do things that were probably very unwise, potentially a bad idea for all of them, including myself. But that happens all the time. There are constantly people. There are the magicians at work who are casting spells with their words, and people become mesmerized by those things and follow them, usually off a cliff.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all your input throughout this whole series, Professor Spence. It's been fantastic. Adam, do you have time to jump in real quick? Okay. All right. I think Adam had to dip out, but yeah, you guys, we did it. John, I'm going to kick it back to you for your final thoughts on all this.
Well, this has been a real privilege and pleasure to meet everyone here again and to have been involved in the other ones. It's been a real journey, this. And what it's taught me is how there are elements of truth that can be drawn from a wide variety of lives and experiences and knowledge and understandings, and that we shouldn't exclude any of them. We really need to look at all sources of knowledge and wisdom and learn how to discern what we can from those, and how we can use observation, as Richard says. What do people do, not what do they say? What does the text mean, not what does it, not what are the words, not just the visible words. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been an eye-opener and a launch pad, I hope, for further investigation into this crazy world and the people who really run things.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you for all your hard work and dedication to the truth and for putting out this book. And once again, I hope everybody gets a copy, TrineDay.com. Owner, operator, legend over at TrineDay.com, Mr. Chris Milligan. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, first, I want to thank everybody, for their time for this, for the authors and researchers that have come on and helped us to discuss this book and the world. Okay, because I didn't start off to be a publisher. Okay, I started a record store when I was 18 and soon started a band and was doing with music. And and then my daddy took me in a room with a professor from Vanderbilt and told me some things I didn't understand. And I've been trying to, understand what my daddy told me, and which related to how the world really works. Okay. And it's been an amazing journey. And one of the things that it's taught me is that, books are just very important things. Okay. They just sit there silently and somebody picks it up and they read some, and it changes their life. And so I just draw, and you can't just read one book to figure it out. Okay. You really need to study it, and then listen to some of the people that have been down some of the rabbit holes and have run around. And again, it is my posit that basically, we're dealing with a secret societal system that imposes its will upon us through intelligence agencies, criminal gangs, religious organizations, fraternal organizations into the sovereign countries. Okay. And then sets up these huge, big psychological warfares. Okay. To keep us people, not really knowing what's going on, and following, one thing from here to there. And, and they get us, into little camps. Okay. And, they give the left honest things to carry. They give the right honest things to carry. And then those honest things get debased by having them fight each other. Okay. And so there was an amazing event that when our founding fathers set up the United States of America, okay, and we're striving for government of and by and for the people, okay, and sovereign money, okay, money that is backed by, your country. I mean, it's no Abraham Lincoln and JFK issued greenbacks. Both of them got killed. Okay, and it wasn't just because of that. I mean, there's major, psychological warfare. Okay, using narratives, to control us. So I'm very supportive of what Guido is talking about, and that's what these roundtables are, kind of a thing. They're kind of a a teaching thing that is available to the whole world. I mean, we aren't charging money for this. This is just going up there for free. And so I want to, put out the word that yes, let's create And we are creating, all of us together are creating a new narrative. Okay, and so let's work towards that, and like I say over and over again, onwards to a better future for our children, because what do we have to leave but our children, and what do we have to leave to them but a future? And I just keep hoping and hoping for a better world.
Absolutely. Well, onward to a better future for all of us, hopefully. And yeah, what an amazing series, what an amazing conversation. So again, I want to reiterate what Chris said, and just want to thank everybody for joining us, for your time, your input, your expertise, and your ongoing dedication to truth and just the elevation of humankind. So as listeners, I want you all to go to the episode description. You'll find more information about each one of the presenters here today. So go follow and support each one of their various forms of different work, buy their books, spread their work, and that's how we take the power back. And please, once again, TrineDay.com. Go get a copy of Two World Wars and Hitler, to find out who was responsible. Okay, so read the book and spread this information far and wide. So, wow, we did it, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm Scott Armstrong, Rebunk.News, and we are signing off the TrineDay Studio Sessions podcast. Peace.
Thank you.